This isn't just about changing the law, it's about changing the culture. And I don't know how you do that, because these ideas are embedded on all sides of the political spectrum.
We are the majority, they are the few, right? And the reason they are ramping up the censorship is because they, at some level, they know that these views are the warped views.
I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spikes, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to welcome you all to the first panel of the day, Free Speech, Identity, and Cancellation. Free speech really is in the lifeblood of what we do at Spiked. We were warning about the insidious creep of censorship long before the first speech criminal was suffered a dawn raid from the tweet police. But I think even those of us who were hardened free speech warriors, I think will maybe have been surprised, may still be alarmed at the horrifying state of free speech in Britain today, and the kind of dystopian regime of censorship that we now live under. Our once free country now arrests people for expressing outre opinions. The police treat allegations of hate speech more seriously than physical violence, and even expressing the wrong views can lead to you being sacked from your job, can lead to criminal sanctions, and you can be hounded out of your life by the mob. But perhaps the tide is turning, and that's something we want to be able to discuss today. We've got an absolutely A-grade panel here for that, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're speaking. Sadly, Toby Young was unable to be here, but we've still got an absolutely fantastic set of speakers for you. So first up will be Allison Pearson, Telegraph columnist, co-host of the brilliant Planet Normal podcast, and a martyr of the law police. Then will come someone who really needs no introduction. It's the editor of Spikes, Tom Slater.
Hey.
And the wonderful comedian, writer, broadcaster, and author of The End of Woke, Andrew Doyle. So I'm now going to invite our panel to speak for 7 to 8 minutes each, and then we're going to come right out to the audience. So have a think about what you want to say, your questions, your thoughts, your points, the things you want to get off your chest. We're really keen to hear from you guys, because you're our supporters, you're what make Spiked possible. So thank you all for coming. Alison, I'm going to start off with you, given you've had, I think it's fair to say, the closest brush with the thought police of any of us on the panel.
I have. Am I allowed to stand up and read?
Absolutely.
Okay,
I think so.
okay. Thank you. Thank you. Right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be here at the Spike Summit. What an amazing turnout. I'd like to thank Tom, Fraser, Brendan, and the whole team for what I'm sure we'd all agree is our favourite source of far-right misinformation. You know, if you'd asked me to give a list of things I might end up doing in my life, one thing which would definitely not have featured on the list would be suing the police. I'm quite a conservative, small c person, law-abiding, pick up my cockapoo's poo, bin it, you know, put it in the right bin. So taking legal action against Essex police would have been unthinkable. Yet here I am doing exactly that. It's stressful, upsetting, and realistically, quite possibly futile. So why should we bother suing the police? You know, if you found yourself living in an era where the free, live and let live, piss-taking, go on then, love, country that we grew up in behaves in the most un-British way imaginable, sending 2 coppers to your house for something you said on social media, then I don't know about you, but I feel the correct British reaction is to tell the police where they can stuff their hate crime incidents. My case is not particularly terrible. We can think of what happened to the wonderful Graham Linehan or my friend Lucy Connolly. jailed for 31 months for one nasty tweet written on a very, very dark day in our history. Lucy was stitched up by the police, the CPS, and the Attorney General, no less, the marvellous Richard Hermer. They all made sure that Lucy, a previously blameless Northampton childminder, would be intimidated into pleading guilty and then received a draconian sentence. Some of you will be familiar with what happened to me. Just in brief, on the morning of Remembrance Sunday 2024, I was getting ready to go to the War Memorial when two police officers turned up on my doorstep. They said it was to do with a tweet I'd posted and deleted 12 months earlier. So I asked what was the tweet, and the officer said, "We're not allowed to tell you that, madam." And then I said, "So who is my accuser?" And he said, "We're not allowed to tell you that either, but it's not the accuser, madam, it's the victim." The first victim I'd ever had. You know, I'd always been concerned about free speech. I'd written often in my Telegraph column about some of the crazier cases taken up by the magnificent Free Speech Union. But there is nothing like having the police telling you you're not even allowed to know what you've done wrong, to literally bring it home to you what has happened to civil liberties in this country. And you know, until then I hadn't realized that anyone, literally a total stranger, can claim to have experienced hatred as a result of something you or I or Spiked had posted. There doesn't even need to be any proof that you meant to do harm. It's just the perception of hostility is enough to land you in trouble. And it was a chilling experience, I'll be honest. One half of your brain is protesting, "This is completely ridiculous, I've done nothing wrong." And the other half is meanwhile saying, "I'm under investigation by the police, this is terrifying." Ben Julian Harrington, the Chief Constable of Essex, told his officers that my case was madness. It was a shame, the Chief Constable said, for so much media to fixate on simply one 5-minute conversation with a journalist. Now, most people didn't think it was the media reaction that was madness. They thought it was the police who had gone mad. Normal people in my Essex market town couldn't believe that the same police who won't come out to investigate a burglary or a car theft could waste their time making a house call on a member of the press. Around the world, our friends and allies could hardly believe it. What is happening in the UK, they asked. The Wall Street Journal ran a scathing opinion piece on my case with the headline, "Britain Police's Speech, but not much else." On the way here, I was trying to think of how to say this to you. The police are a cult. The police that you and I grew up watching, police on the telly, the Sweeney and Prime Suspect, those police don't exist anymore. It is an indoctrinated identity politics cult. And as with so many rotten ideas, really, this hate crime idea started out with noble intentions. We had the Macpherson report, which followed the shocking murder of black teenager Stephen Lawrence. And that report found that the Metropolitan Police were institutionally racist. Now, that had an unbelievably profound effect on policing. All the police who are chief constables and senior officers today were probationers when that damning report was published in 1999. And every promotion those police have had is about expressing support for diversity, community relations, and anti-racism. So the Macpherson report made the police more ideologically and politically motivated. Instead of policing for the whole nation by consent, they started owing their loyalty to so-called communities. Indeed, not so long ago, someone shared a leaked document with me from Essex Police. It revealed, you're going to love this, that white people are a non-protected group. That would come as a bit of a shock to the 90.4% of Essex residents who are still white, identifying as white, and expect the police they pay for to protect them. But no, in the hierarchy of so-called protected characteristics, police are taught that white people enjoy a privileged status. And in order to achieve equity, the Police Race Action Plan states that being colorblind will not achieve the desired outcome. It's necessary to actively treat certain protected groups differently. I just want to give you an example, quick example of my tweet. They never confirmed what my offensive tweet was, but I think it's where I talked about police cuddling up to the Jew haters. And that tweet, I believe, was perceived to be Islamophobic. And Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hostility, as we must learn to call this new backdoor blasphemy law, that is the most serious offense they can think of. Now, at the same time as I posted my Jew haters tweet, a Jewish woman complained to Essex police about a grotesquely anti-Semitic tweet, very, very inflammatory, and she got a reply from Essex Hate Crime Unit saying, "We're sorry you were upset, but feelings were running high. That tweet was posted in the heat of the moment. No further action." Now, you'd think the Jews had done their best to be a protected characteristic, wouldn't you? They gave it their best shot between 1939 and 1945, didn't they? 6 million victims of racial hatred, but not as far as the British police are concerned. I've been told that Jews are viewed by some police as white supremacists, which does rather explain the two-tier policing of the pro-Pal marches, which, as I predicted in my offending tweet, led to police being seen to take a side with disastrous consequences for community cohesion and an emboldening of anti-Semitism in our country. Hate crime is a growth industry, a senior officer told me, because it helps reinforce the College of Policing's diversity ideology. The more hate crime they can record, the better they can show there is a problem in society, which justifies them ignoring traditional crime and directing resources to policing opinions. What you have to understand, Allison, this officer said, is they want people to be afraid of saying things. And so with a terrible inevitability, this anti-white racism in the police, arising from an imported critical race theory, led to the horrific scene of a young student in Southampton lying on the ground, mortally wounded, stabbed by Vikram Digwa with a 20H blade, crying out to police officers for help. "I've been stabbed," Henry Novak said 4 times. "I can't breathe," he said. 9 times he told police he couldn't breathe. We can imagine, can't we, how Henry's fear may have eased a little when he knew the police had arrived. Thank God, help is here. Reassuring figures in uniform, they will protect me from the madman with the sword. But help was not at hand. The police did not protect him. Quite the opposite, for all humanity had been trained out of those officers by the College of Policing. "I don't think you have, mate," was one officer's larky response to Henry's insistence he had been stabbed. They were doing exactly as they had been programmed to do by all those DEI seminars. Digmar had brown skin, carrying a traditional sword. He told police he'd been attacked racially. The lad on the ground, claiming to be wounded, was white. Believe me, ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing in 2026 a police officer fears more than an allegation of racism. One senior police officer said to me, "There is no chief constable in the country. All chief constables would rather fuck up a major murder inquiry than be accused of racism." So that's where we are. And Mark Novak, Henry's wonderful father, in his very immensely dignified statement, said, "To my dying son, who I love beyond words, I'm so sorry that I let this happen." Henry's father didn't let it happen. Successive governments, the woke College of Policing and their awful discriminatory race action plan, chief constables who have to be word perfect in the mantras of the diversity cult to climb the greasy pole, a complicit left-wing media, all the brainwashed agencies of the British state who have forced multiculturalism on a reluctant population and indoctrinated police officers to overcome their natural human instincts for a dying child and show bigotry against white people, they are the ones to blame. Police didn't fail Henry Novak by mistake, as they tried to claim. Those officers who arrived at the scene were following orders. They had been brainwashed to give priority to ethnic minority victims. So all of this and more, we'll talk about this much more, is what I found out since the police came to my door that Remembrance Sunday. I was once someone who respected and trusted the police. Now I despise them. We have made some progress, and we will talk about that. The scrapping of 9 non-crime hate incidents was a victim for the Free Speech Union and many in this room who'd campaigned against them. But it's still not enough. The police are captured by an anti-racist cult. If, please God, we have a right of centre government from 2029, it needs to shut down the College of Policing and replace it with a new organisation dedicated to training, re-qualified chief officers on a new course which prioritises common sense and is against identity politics, scrap the Equality Act, and the whole notion of protected characteristics has to go. Policing for the whole nation, not communities. Scrap hate crime incidents of all kinds. Prosecute people for the actual harm they've done, not for thought processes or speech or tweets. Finally, there are still lots of good police officers who despair, as we all despair. And they ask me, please would you take legal action against the police to hold their woke, ideologically driven senior officers to account, because it's the only way we're going to stop this nonsense. And I'll be honest, I don't relish it. Some are born brave, some achieve braveness, some have bravery thrust upon them. I'm very firmly in the third cowards category. But as the great Harry Miller, ex-police officer who keeps arresting police now, and free speech warrior, Harry said to me, those of us with the strength and mental fortitude to hold these twats to account have an obligation to do so. I think Harry's right. It's a public duty. Let's hold those twats to account. I will keep you and everyone at Spike posted as to how the legal action is going. And finally, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear.
Fantastic. That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Alison. And now we're going to hear from Tom Slater.
Thank you. I'm going to sit down for this purely because I'm right next to this fan. And I don't want to get out of the way of it. I mean, you can tell things have gotten so bad with woke culture that the police have managed to pull off the incredible trick of turning the right-wing press against them, which is pretty remarkable from what Alison has talked about there. I think that where Britain's crisis of free speech is concerned, it was probably always going to get worse before it got better. But boy, has it gotten bad so far. I mean, the fact that according to that Times investigation a couple of years ago, 30 people every single day are being arrested in England and Wales for posting offensive things online. I mean, incidentally, that's more people than America were arresting for speech during the first Red Scare. I mean, if this isn't a matter of national shame, if this isn't a free speech crisis, I don't know what is. And it's verging on turning us into an international laughingstock. But I think one positive from all of that is that it has created a sense of alarm, a sense of public interest in this particular story. People have realised things have gone very badly wrong. And at a level that, for all the time that Spiked has been writing about this issue for our 25 plus years, certainly for the 13 years I've been writing about this, that wasn't there beforehand. So maybe that's something to build on. People have woken up to what is going on with the police, with the criminal justice system, and they're not going to have it anymore. I think the first thing to acknowledge in all of this, though, is that our culture of woke censorship is actually very entrenched. There is a tendency to see it as something that started about 5 minutes ago. But really, when you look at it, we've been conducting a kind of 60-year experiment in policing hate. The notion of inciting racial hatred, which our resident hater Allison was originally accused of committing, was first introduced with the Race Relations Act in 1965. You have the New Labour years, of course, with the Racial and Religious Hatred Act, introducing this incredibly poisonous idea of incitement to religious hatred, even though that legislation did have its wings clipped by Rowan Atkinson and various other principled campaigners. And we've ended up with speech laws that are at once authoritarian, absurd, and cruel. You saw this in the 2010s, the sort of combination of things like the Communications Act, which it contains that now infamous provision clamping down on grossly offensive speech. You combine that with the rise of social media, and there were just this flurry of cases of essentially drunk teenagers having to spend weeks, sometimes months, in prison because they had a few too many one night and posted something that they would later regret. There was a bloke called Matthew Woods who in 2012, he was convicted for his grossly offensive Facebook posts. He was jailed for 3 months and he was just copying and pasting Madeleine McCann jokes from a website called Wikipedia after having had a skinful one night. So it's gotten so out of hand that even cases that clearly have nothing to do with clamping down on the most extreme among us are in the papers almost every day now. And as it goes, it's interesting that on this sort of trajectory of woke censorship that we've been going on, or just censorship, to be frank, we've gone almost in the precise opposite direction to where America has gone. Of course, it's in the 1960s that the First Amendment gets its teeth, that through a lot of litigation during the Civil Rights Movement, that actually America began to enjoy the very firm free speech protections that we have today. And I think many people on this side of the pond have grown to envy a fair bit. But returning to Britain, and particularly with Labour and its most recent attempts to clamp down on Islamophobia, this nonsense concept which is at the forefront of really cracking down on criticism of Islam, albeit where the Labour Party are at the moment through kind of non-statutory guidance rather than law. I think what we see in Britain in particular is that the project of censorship is now utterly bound up with the project of multiculturalism. That the British state from top to bottom has imbibed this very divisive, very liberal idea that censorship is absolutely necessary to the maintenance of multicultural harmony, that censorship is all that stands between civilization and barbarism, and that your average Brit is only a few spicy social media posts away from launching a pogrom. This is the incredibly low view that they have of the public. And I think it also betrays just a complete betrayal and inversion of our entire liberal Enlightenment tradition. I mean, the concepts of freedom of speech and toleration as they were articulated in this country were argued for precisely because when John Locke was writing and so on, it was seen as absolutely necessary to people being able to have out what were then religious differences without recourse to violence or to censorship. And yet we now have a governing class which to a man and woman seems gripped by this idea that, again, the censor is all that stands between civilization and barbarism. It's what has made someone like Keir Starmer as a politician, someone who is at once so authoritarian and yet so boring. It's just become kind of part and parcel of the outlook. And so whilst I'm sure, this man who seems like a sort of middle manager, a man who seems like he irons his underpants in the morning, could preside over a state that was locking up people at a rate of knots, because it's just become the kind of common sense of the establishment, if you like. Also, this approach, the idea that you need to censor in order to maintain social calm, is clearly not working, is it? I mean, if you see what's been going on our streets at the moment, the restive atmosphere out there, from protests through to despicable rioting that we've seen kick off from time to time, the attempts by the authorities to, say, clamp down on discussion of illegal and mass migration, to control the flow of information about, say, the identity of a particular perpetrator in the case of a particularly heinous crime, it's precisely that which is inflaming these tensions. It's certainly not doing anything to calm them. So a reckoning with our speech laws, I think, also necessarily involves a reckoning with multiculturalism, with this idea that we need censorship to maintain harmony, this idea that minorities need to be protected, not just from discrimination and violence, but from hurty words. And as Allison has already touched on, this idea that we've had since Macpherson in particular, which is that racism is essentially in the eye of the beholder, or the eye of the police officer who is investigating you, which has proven to be incredibly pernicious. So if we are to challenge our speech laws, we need to really start repealing them left, right and centre. But I think what we also need to do, and I think this is also a crucial point, is that we need a culture of freedom of speech. We need a kind of deep-seated aversion amongst the heart of the British citizenry to the idea that someone should be locked up for expressing a dissenting opinion or just saying something one night that maybe they would later live to regret. And what with America celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence at the moment, as Mick was talking about at the beginning, I think we can actually take a fair amount of inspiration from the revolutionary generation in that era and how they rebelled against the King's censorious writ in those days, which they basically just ignored it. They said no, they defied it. They wrote pamphlets, they wrote broadsides, they burned giant effigies of political leaders, completely in defiance of the common law speech laws. So I'm not saying that we should all gather on Parliament Square today and join and burn a giant effigy of Andy Burnham or Keir Starmer, wherever it might be. It's too hot for that, if nothing else. But nevertheless, I think that defiant spirit is something that we can learn from. This is something that Stephen Solomon points out in his book, Revolutionary Dissent, about that generation. Even when people would land themselves on trial for seditious libel, as it was then called, juries would just refuse to convict them. And I think we saw an interesting echo of that actually in the UK in the wake of the Southport riots with a case that many of you may have heard of Jamie Michael. Jamie, as many of you may know, was a Royal Marine who was living in South Wales, was so incensed by Southport, he took to Facebook to record a very impassioned video, arrested for inciting racial hatred, although the police told him at the time it was indecent racial hatred, which isn't actually a crime. But nevertheless, that tells you what we're up against. But he was held on remand for 17 days, but because of his own courage and bloody-mindedness, pleaded not guilty, and when he got to trial, a jury of his peers acquitted him in 17 minutes. So that, I think, is what we need to see more of. I think all of this speaks to George Orwell hasn't been quoted yet, so I'm glad that I got in there first, but it speaks to a point that he made very well, is that if large numbers of people are interested in freedom of speech, there will be freedom of speech, even if the law forbids it. But if public opinion is sluggish, inconvenient minorities will be persecuted, even if laws exist to protect them. Even though these days we have to add the majority opinion, which seems to be the one which is often persecuted these days. But on that cultural point, and I'll leave you with this, we are confronted these days with one particularly stubborn dilemma, which is what happens in multicultural Britain when there are groups who have markedly different attitudes towards freedom of speech. Indeed, some groups who see it as their religious responsibility to say protect the Prophet Muhammad from mockery or the Quran from desecration. There was a fascinating piece of research that Policy Exchange put out, actually authored by Rakib Hassan, Spike columnist who will be speaking to you a little bit later today, about migration. And they looked at areas in which those Islamic sectarian kind of Gaza independent candidates were standing and found that British Muslim voters there had markedly different, shall we say, attitudes towards the right of blasphemy, as it's seen. 52% of them supporting making it a crime to depict Muhammad, 63% of them supporting making it a crime to burn holy books. Most shocking of all, 24% of them believing that violence is sometimes justified when people do either of those two things, depict the Prophet or burn those holy books. This is a recipe not only for censorship and fear, but murder. And if we want to free Britain from censorship, if we want that cultural of freedom, I think we need to free ourselves of that cultural relativism that has allowed those very medieval attitudes to grow unchecked. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. And now, Andrew.
I'm going to go on the podium.
As you wish.
This is more dramatic. Okay. Thank you. Thank you to Spike for inviting me and bringing me over here from Arizona where we have air conditioning. And scorpions, so it swings and roundabouts. And thank you all for coming along as well. So I've been thinking a lot lately about Zach Polanski, which is very exciting stuff. So he is quite the character. I'm not talking about his hypnotherapy breast thing. That's a whole other thing. He is quite censorial. He's quite authoritarian. When Graham Linehan was arrested at Heathrow by five armed officers for 3 joke tweets, Zach Polanski said, "These are totally unacceptable tweets. I think it was proportionate to arrest him." I think of Tim Waltz over in the US, who had a debate with J.D. Vance for the vice presidential debate, and he said that the First Amendment does not cover misinformation, and it does not cover hate speech. I'll give you another example of this kind of person. Ursula von der Leyen, who's the president of the European Commission, she wanted to create a European democracy shield, which was to tackle disinformation. And she said this incredible thing. She said she didn't want to debunk things that were wrong. She wanted to pre-bunk things that were wrong. Now that's quite a chilling idea. You may have read it before if you know Philip K. Dick and Minority Report. It's a thing called pre-crime. And it really occurs to me when I think of Zach Polanski and Tim Waltz and Ursula von der Leyen and all of these people, they all share this same quality. They want to censor things that they consider to be wrong, that they consider to be beyond the pale, or that they consider to be misinformation. There is, however, a quite fundamental flaw in their reasoning. And it's a very serious flaw at the heart of their perspective. And I honestly, I just wonder whether it's ever crossed their minds. And the flaw is this. Zach Polanski, Tim Waltz, and Ursula von der Leyen are pretty much always wrong about everything. So if it's them who get to decide what is misinformation, what ought to be censored, then we're all fucked, aren't we? It's a very fundamental problem with their rationale. You know, Polanski wants to arrest comedians for telling jokes, but he also thinks it's a tragedy when posh kids get arrested for whacking police officers with sledgehammers. So he has a very selective idea about what constitutes violence and what is offensive. So apparently words are violence, sledgehammers are just free speech, right? Now that's a problem, I think. And of course he's had various of his candidates at the local elections saying some incredibly anti-Semitic stuff. I think one of his councillors actually described Jewish people as cockroaches. And apparently that's okay, but making jokes on Twitter, that's the real problem. Now, what I wanted to just talk about today is something which I think we often skip around. And I think it's quite important, which is why do these people believe what they believe? Why do the censorial people in society think that censorship is a good idea? Because I think once we grapple with that, with the reason behind their thought process, we might be better equipped to tackle it. There's a number of reasons. I mean, one of the most obvious reasons is sheer arrogance, okay? They think they've got all the answers, and of course we would be fools not to defer to them. And that mindset is particularly common among culture warriors, you know. Their default question seem not to be, why does this person disagree with me? But why is this person so evil and twisted that they would disagree with me? That seems to be the approach. And you see their tendency as well to read people's minds. So they always say, oh, well, this person is saying this, but they secretly must think someone else. Right? So if you're concerned about the introduction of digital ID or age verification for social media, it's because you want to protect paedophiles. That's what's going on in your head. If you believe that human beings can't change sex because they can't, then you're a fascist. You're secretly a fascist. If you're concerned about immigration, unchecked immigration, you're secretly a white supremacist. So again, it comes down to this very narcissistic worldview. I think there is a real correlation between those who are for censorship, against free speech, and a kind of narcissism, because their view is that anyone who disagrees with them must be doing so out of nefarious reasons, and that their position must be the default. And as a corollary to that, of course, that means that any alternative view, since I am good, anything that counters my view must be evil, and then by extension, we can censor it, and we absolutely should. And I consider this a kind of mass infantilism. Right, so that's the first problem. That's the first problem or the first reason, I think, why people believe in censorship, just because they haven't really grown up. And I think that if we could instill in schools critical thinking at every level of the curriculum, not as a separate lesson or anything, but just have critical thinking as a sort of baseline in every subject, in every discipline. You know, if children were taught that, if they were taught how to argue, if they were taught that assuming bad motives, that throwing insults, that making straw man claims, that means you've lost. If they just left school with that baseline, we wouldn't have half of the problems that we've got now. But we have the problem now, and we have to deal with it. But there is more to it than just narcissism and a conviction that someone is right. One of the other major reasons is the influence of postmodernism. So you had a handful of French philosophers from the 1960s who were playing with various ideas. They weren't, by the way, saying that reality doesn't exist, truth doesn't exist. But that's the way it's since been interpreted, and that is the legacy. And their belief was that our understanding of reality is produced within the context of linguistic and cultural frameworks, and that knowledge is a construct of power wielded oppressively through language. And therefore, by extension, censorship is important in order to reshape society, in order to redress injustice, in order to break down that dichotomy of oppressor and oppressed. That is the notion of this 1960s postmodernism that not only has survived to today, but is a kind of default position of many individuals who now support censorship. And their logic is quite simple. If we simply eliminate the terms by which racism or homophobia or sexism or transphobia or any phobia you want to drop in there, if we eliminate the terms by which those ideas can be expressed, then those ideas simply cease to be. Because if reality is wholly constructed through language, you just have to limit language and all of our problems are solved. As Tom pointed out, it's clearly not the case that that happens. But of course, the postmodernists were wrong. Language doesn't produce reality. It's merely one of the means by which it is communicated and understood. Now, this goes back right back to 1984, to George Orwell. Of course, one of the points of the party is to limit language, okay? To create phrases so you have to say double plus good instead of excellent or wonderful. Limit language, limit thought. That is the view. So that's the second major point. So the first was this idea that, obviously there's a narcissism to the censor, a presumption of infallibility. But this second point is there is this genuine postmodernist bent, which is threaded throughout all of our major institutions. Alison was talking about the police, of course. It's in there, it's in all of their guidance books issued by the MPCC and the College of Policing. It's there in the NHS. Tom mentioned this interconnectivity of multiculturalism and the need for censorship. It's precisely because of this idea, this postmodernist idea, that was once just being played around with in universities and has now been applied. They call it praxis. And so now we're in a situation where figures of authority believe that if they say something, it makes it so. It isn't about describing reality, it's about creating reality through the way that you describe it. So you can describe a protest as largely peaceful, even if 30-odd police officers have been beaten up, and it becomes largely peaceful. It doesn't matter. You can say, like that guy on CNN who talked about the mostly peaceful protests while there are burning cars behind him, people trashing shops. It's mostly peaceful. You just say it and it makes it so. It's like an incantation. Keir Starmer is the same. Keir Starmer recently said that the thing he's most proud of, or one of the things he's most proud of, is that he has restored Great Britain's reputation on the international stage. Now that is quite palpably an absurd thing to say, but he thinks by saying it, it makes it true. It's wishful thinking. But it all comes back to this idea, this postmodernist idea. And this notion underpins all of the claims that we have that words are violence. So there was a recent poll by FIRE, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression in America. They found that 91% of undergraduate students believe that words can be violence. And as a corollary to that, 34% of students now say that using violence to stop someone from speaking on campus is acceptable in rare cases. When we think about that, one third of American students think that violence can be justified to silence someone they don't agree with, because they've conflated the two concepts, words and violence. And I think, again, this goes back to a failure of education. It goes back to the way in which postmodernist ideology has been embedded into education, into teacher training, into all aspects of the curricula, and it needs to be weeded out. And finally, if I've got time, this is the third major reason why I think censors believe that they are right to censor. And this is one that I don't think we address at all, and I think it's really important. And it's a fallacy, and the fallacy is this. There is now a generalized belief, which is held by virtually all of the political class and the media class, that the words we hear directly cause people to act on cue. That is a belief that is just completely accepted, and there are endless examples of this. Just to give you one recent example, so the other week there was that horrific stabbing in Edinburgh. A man went on the rampage to stab people who he saw as Muslim, and he's been arrested. Absolutely horrific case. And Humza Yousaf, the former First Minister of Scotland, he blamed Rupert Lowe. Not the guy with the knife, he blamed Rupert Lowe. He tweeted, he said, "Hey Rupert Lowe, you blew the dog whistle this week, and people have reacted exactly how you wanted them to." What is that dog whistle? That was a report into the rape gangs. So apparently, the rape gangs, which the guy who went on this rampage, he said that was the reason he did it. as deluded and crazy and psychopathic as it was. But apparently it's not that prompted him to do it. It was people talking about it, people like Rupert Lowe. We had the same with Zach Polanski again, our old mate. He blamed, not the guy with the knife, he blamed Elon Musk. He said, let's be very clear that vicious anti-Muslim hatred by politicians and their trillionaire mate, Elon Musk, created the conditions for this vile attack. Not one tweet from Humza Yousaf or Zach Polanski about the guy who actually did it. Now, as I say, the man's been charged. We know that this was horrific. But we do have to get back to this idea of individual human agency. We have this view, and it is too often accepted, that when it comes to violent acts, we have to look for other people to blame, the people who have stirred up hatred, which is the rubric that is often used. This is why the police behave the way they do. Gavin Stevens, who was the chair of the National Police Chiefs Council, he said in November 2024, hate left unaddressed, whether that's propagated online or in person, has real-world consequences. The entire theory of non-crime hate incidents, the idea that the police should monitor our opinions, goes all the way back to a book from 1954 called The Nature of Prejudice by Gordon Allport. And he developed this 5-point scheme, a sliding scale, which has become known as the pyramid of hate, where one thing leads to another. And you can actually see this pyramid. I mean, it's been used in police training. And their view is that it starts with mean comments, and then it goes right up to genocide. And that's their view. And that is actually informing police practice, okay? So one day you're slagging off Liverpudlians, and the next day you're out beating people up with clubs. And they honestly believe this. And I do think we have to interrogate this fundamental premise. And this comes onto a debate about incitement to violence. Because I think if your initial premise is flawed, every other chain of your rationale is flawed. It simply isn't true, is it? It simply isn't true. We've had 6 decades of research into media effects theories. The idea that the public act on cue according to the mass media that they imbibe has been thoroughly debunked. It's simply not the case. And yet we have people in Parliament saying you mustn't use phrases like traitor because that will stir someone to go out and stab a politician. After the horrific death of Sir David Amess, it wasn't about addressing the problem of Islamism that actually resulted in the death. It was about let's crack down on free speech online, which has absolutely nothing to do with it. And I really want to just end on this point because I think it's so key. There is no act that any human being can commit that is not in some way influenced by conditions or prompted or related to various stimuli in someone's life. There's no violent act certainly is bereft of impetus. But we cannot be in a position where we are trying to apportion blame according to things that people have heard, which may or may not have influenced them to do certain things. It is completely unquantifiable. You can't quantify the influence of what you see on the news, what you hear politicians say, what you read on social media. You can't even quantify the effects of propaganda. All that you can quantify is individual agency and individual decision-making, which is something that is definitely true. We cannot just simply say, because Brenda Spencer went on a shooting spree at an elementary school because she said, I don't like Mondays. We can't say Mondays are to blame. We must ban Mondays. Let's just go straight from Sunday to Tuesday and everything will be fine, right? We can't say that the killer of John Lennon, because he said he was inspired to do it by Catcher in the Rye. We can't just ban J.D. Salinger and think that the problem goes away. Because this stuff just simply isn't true. So I will just end on this point. The decisions that people make are their own. And given what all of the studies in this area tell us, that there simply is no direct causal link between words and violence, we need to stop allowing people in authority, police, politicians, the media class, to pretend that it is. It isn't simply that this is a theory that is open to discussion. This theory has been comprehensively debunked. And so we need the people in control of our laws, in control of our media, to understand that very fundamental point and to act accordingly. Thanks very much.
Well, that was absolutely excellent, but now we want to hear from you guys. So I've seen a question already right there. Let's keep the contributions relatively short and sharp so that everyone can get a word in. Can we get a mic to the lady there? Hands up straight away.
Oh, just there. Do you want to send the mic to someone else as well?
Yeah, and anyone else while we're waiting as well?
Yeah.
Someone down there with the, yeah, okay.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Mick Hume said in his opening, sorry, is this okay? It's working all right?
Yeah.
Sounds very echoey. Mick said in his opening remarks that Spiked was really birthed with the kind of launch of the internet more broadly. And I think the change in 20 years is that it's now the main source where most people get their news from nowadays. But I think something else that's changed is that 20 years ago, the internet was seen as this really exciting place. It was seen as like a real positive that you would have this free speech, that it would open up democracy and allow everyone to take part in debate. And that has changed, and it now seems that there's so much panic about what people might read online, hence Allison's experience and the police focusing upon people policing tweets. But I mean, we also had Starmer this week suggesting that he might be able to control what comes up first on people's Google search so that people come across kind of official approved sources of information, such as the BBC and Channel 4 News, his preferred sources, first. Now, this really, really concerns me because it's not just about censorship, but it's about controlling what people are up to, what people are able to access and read. At risk of kind of putting a fly in the ointment of the consensus on the panel, I am very, very concerned about social media bans for children, precisely because of all of these reasons. I think we must not be naive that kind of claiming, oh, won't someone think of the children, is just another way of bringing in more censoriousness, more controls on what every adult can see online. Any woman or man who has taken part in debates about transgender, about racism online, will be aware of why anonymity is not is important for people taking part in online discussions. The idea that I sit in front of a computer and put in my passport, my name, my address, my date of birth, hand all of that information over to some online provider and trust that those people will not hand it over to the police if I post something a little bit saucy online, I think you'd be very, very naive not to think that that was the case. I think it undermines the authority of parents. It takes away all adult responsibility when we say, think of the children and ban social media. And it will end up dictating what we all can and can't see.
Gentleman there.
Really good analysis of the situation. I can see we can change the politicians, we can change the laws, but what is the way to actually deal with the embedded problem of all the leadership people who are actually implementing this nonsense?
Great question. Gentleman there in the blue turquoise, and a gentleman on the other side, if we can get a mic to him as well.
Yeah, I wonder if the panel would like to comment on the way in which the sort of neo-authoritarians are now not just seeking to control what we can say in public, but even in private. So Hamza Yusuf, for example, got the ball rolling in Scotland with a hate speech law about 3 years ago, which potentially criminalizes private conversations. And we learn now that the government is going to pass an extraordinary bill banning so-called LGBT plus conversion therapy, which in effect is banning consenting conversations between parents, psychotherapists, and their children and patients. I mean, this is literally incredible, but there doesn't seem to be much opposition to it.
And over there, yep.
Tony Brown. Would the panel agree that repeal of the 2010 Equalities Act is absolutely central to the delivery of free speech and everything you've called for? And I say that noting that my understanding is that Reform has said that it will repeal that act, but the Conservative Party and Kemi Badenoch remain silent on the subject.
Let's see a few more hands. Yes, lady down there. And a lady over there as well. Is anyone down? So you can get that one to the woman here, and then this one to the woman near the front. I think you've got the mic first, so you should.
Hi. Just asking quickly, free speech requires all voices at some point be heard. When you have an avalanche of 99 people saying a man can be a woman, how do you get the other side across? How do you get equal, you need to be able to argue the points, but you can't. So what are the limits of free speech in regard to that then? Or how do you elevate the opposite side?
And yep, there.
Hi. Just want to raise the issue of public money and spending and how many of these issues are embedded now with public funding following Blair's kind of creation of Quango's public money being spent on charities with particular agendas, and how influential that has been on our politics in the UK, and how it could be an issue that could be addressed quite quickly. If you look at what Trump and the administration did at the beginning, they stood on a mandate to review, audit and reprioritise public money spending around the Doge issue, whether we should do something similar in the UK, because I can see that there's a lot of things that are ripe for cuts, in my opinion.
Great. I'm going to come back to the panel, but I will come back out to the audience, so have a think about any questions or points you want to make. I'll come to you first, Andrew. I mean, there's absolutely loads to come back on. Pick anything, don't feel you have to answer everything.
I mean, there's just so much. I mean, a couple of the points are very much connected. And this idea, I mean, the gentleman mentioned Hamza Youssef, when they introduced their hate speech act on April the 1st, so they're clearly trolling us, aren't they? I mean, it's crazy because we did. I run a night called Comedy Unleashed, and we went up there to do a special hate crime special in Scotland on the day that this came into force, and people were genuinely saying to me, "Oh, make sure your phone is either you leave your phone at home or that they can't use your face to get into it." I'm like, I'm not a drug dealer. I'm just going to go and stand on stage and do some jokes. But this was the reality of it, because Hamza Youssef had set up all these hate speech reporting centres. There was one in a sex shop. There was one in a mushroom farm or something. And it sounds insane. It sounds silly. But in the actual draft of his bill, there was the section about public performance of a play. And if a live performance, such as a comedy performance, could be perceived as being stirring up hatred, then that could be banned. And as the gentleman mentioned, you could be prosecuted for things that were said within the privacy of your own home. This rot is so deep that it's really chilling. And that connects to what the chap over here was saying about how do we actually do this? How do we weed this out? Because I don't think it is just a case of repealing a few acts, stripping away the legislation, because what we've seen it again and again is that for these identitarian campaigners, the law does not matter. They have their own law. Look what happened with the Supreme Court ruling that confirmed that sex in the Equality Act means biological sex. Well, it sat on Bridget Phillipson's desk for 13 months before it turned up. And then you have over 100 MPs trying to block the EHRC guidance because they think somehow that will change the law. Because for activists, it doesn't matter what the law is. We've had Stonewall for years telling people what they want the law to be rather than what it actually is. We had the College of Policing was instructed by more than one Home Secretary, 2 Home Secretaries in a row, saying you can't do this anymore, you have to get rid of non-crime hate incidents. They just ignored the government. You had the Crown Prosecution Service lying about Lucy Connolly in Lucy Connolly's case, trying to overturn the appeal of Hamid Koskan, who burned his Quran in a peaceful protest. So you have the engines of the state and the civil service and the CPS at every level working often against the law. We are now in a situation where the police are often acting unlawfully because they've been told to act unlawfully by the people who train them. So this isn't just about changing the law, it's about changing the culture. And I don't know how you do that, because these ideas are embedded on all sides of the political spectrum. It's on the right and the left. I don't think you can just change the laws and expect everything to sort of magically sort itself out. I think it's going to take a fundamental root and branch, which finally comes on to what Leslie was saying about Doge. Frankly, I think the only solution is for whoever's in power next. They have to come in on day one, scrap the College of Policing, scrap the civil service, well, not scrap it, but replace it with something that can actually work. You know, at this point, I'd take a tray of vegetables at this point, but just replace it with something that isn't just an engine for ideology. You have to root and branch. Just do that bonfire of the Quangos we've heard about for many years, but everyone's too scared to do. Why? Just do it. It needs to be done.
Hear, hear. Tom, anything you'd like to come back on in particular?
Yeah, I suppose just first on the question about the Equality Act, absolutely it should be scrapped. All it's done is generate precisely the tensions in society that it was supposed to ameliorate and produce so many absurd, not just cases of sort of cancellation within the workplace, but I think it's also fed its way throughout the entire sort of multicultural state. If you look at the Equality Act, it's public sector equality duty that it imposes on various government bodies to foster good relations between various groups. Basically seems to involve clamping down on public sector workers' speech to an absurd degree and a way that's been had a real impact on their ability to express themselves in the workplace and even outside of it. I think that the issue with the Equality Act is, like all terrible piece of legislation, it's got a brilliant name. Who is against equality? So if Reform or anyone else replaces it, they'll have to call it the Warm Apple Pie and Kittens Act or whatever in order to get that over the line. But that kind of courage is absolutely necessary. Following on from Andrew's point in the question there about what do we do, absolutely shut down the College of Policing. I mean, it essentially invented non-crime hate incidents out of whole cloth. They say it goes back to the McPherson report, but they've loaded so much more onto that anyway and have resisted any of these attempts at reform. And you know, even what their existing guidance said about non-crime hate incidents, they were still applying it to absurd situations. Do you know the one about the guy who had a non-crime hate incident lodged against his barber because he gave him an aggressive haircut? Or funny looks on the bus, or someone whistling Bob the Builder. It would be funny if it wasn't so tyrannical. So I think, yeah, definitely shut down the College of Policing. I think the police should have a total and complete shutdown and ban on hiring university graduates. Yeah. Just until we work out what the hell is going on, because they've been going in the opposite direction. I think the problem is that we have this issue at the moment where even when an edict doesn't come down from on high, because you have had so many people who work in the public sector, who work in government, have essentially gone through the sort of socialisation process of top-class universities, have taken on all of these illiberal prejudices, then they just do it in their everyday work without even noticing. It's like the water that they swim in. So I think that's absolutely essential. And the issue is that it's just trickled down throughout the whole police force. I mean, Andrew, you were talking about the pyramid of hate. And when Harry Miller talks about his experience of being called up by a police officer because he had this non-crime hate incident lodged against him for a gender-critical limerick, let's not forget, he took him through precisely these stages. He said, well, the problem you've got to understand, Mr. Miller, is that it starts with the limericks and that it ends with genocide. Because as we all know, limericks is how Nazi Germany first began. So this is the problem, is that it's become, as I say, the kind of part of the atmosphere, the common sense, or the uncommon sense, if you like, of the governing class, the police, and whatever. And a clear out is absolutely necessary if we're going to start seeing any change on that front.
Absolutely. I think my favourite non-crime hate incident was the man who managed to get one logged against his drug dealer because he was homophobic. And you'll think, well, there was a crime going on there somewhere, but not. Alison.
I think mine was a Telegraph reader said that she and her family had been out horse riding and some charming traveller gentleman drove past, startled the horses, drove the horses into a ditch. One of the children fell off the horse and the travellers got out of the car with a screwdriver and were menacing them. And the nice woman, Eleanor, who got in touch with me, said she'd hurriedly called the police and they turned up at her house later and she was glad they'd come and they arrested her because Eleanor, in her terrified phone call, had referred to the men menacing her husband and children as these pikeys. So that was obviously the main burden of complaint here. Look, I've thought a lot about this. Obviously, everybody in this room disagrees with this shit, right? You know, we know it's ridiculous. So then there are millions of people like us. There are millions and millions of people like us. So we have to make our values prevail. And I've been told that the police, senior police officers see their role as ushering in a progressive utopia. We don't want their progressive utopia. We've never voted for it. We don't agree with it. As Andrew says, we very much don't like the sound of it, so we don't want it. So I think, more democracy. We have to sweep these people away. But also, I do think that this progressive mindset is embedded in the institutions, but I think it's quite thin at the top. I think that if you get rid of the people, the sort of thought leaders, as it were, I don't think it goes very deep. I think most people need to pay the mortgage, right? So if you say, we're scrapping the DEI department here, we're going to look after patients, we're going to arrest bad people, then I think there could be a reset quite quickly. I do think that. And coming to Joe's point, I think we disagree. I have slightly mixed feelings about this social media ban for children. Again, it's something I've been very heavily involved in. I don't think it's an either or. I think smartphones, I think the internet are brain damaging children. I think that in 100 years' time, if there are still civilized people around to reflect, I think they'll think, what the hell did they think they were doing, letting children have access to these things. Since they mentioned the idea of a social media ban, I've had 2 mothers of young children saying how relieved they felt that the children were saying, you know, we can't go on YouTube anymore and watch this stuff because, you know, the government says. So I think that parents do need some help with it. I strongly feel it's not an either or. You could do it with the hardware. It doesn't have to affect adults giving their ages. I really don't think that. I think that's a lie. I think we should ban smartphones for under 6. Any internet-enabled devices for children should be banned, absolutely, because it is doing terrible, terrible things to them. And even to the point where, I don't know if some people have heard about these Facebook Meta whistleblowers who've talked about they know when a teenage girl has posted pictures of her, selfies of herself, taken them down because she feels she looks terrible, and they immediately, the algorithms target that child to bombard her with beauty advertising. Parents can't stand up against that on their own, right? So we do need some kind of control, but I don't think it has to be control at the expense of adults and civil liberties. I think you could do it via the hardware.
Hands up, who wants to speak? Someone there. And on this side, this gentleman there.
Following on from that point, and also from Joe's point, one of the things I'm concerned about is what will divide our resolve. So you've been trying to pinpoint some of the key issues today around free speech, and I think the issue about vulnerability is the way that we could become divided. And I think that's the way I would probably look at the question about social media, because in the way that Colin Brazier looked at the Henry Novak case, and he went back and he did that very good journalistic piece where he said if you trace it back and look at, say, something like Stephen Lawrence, you can see there's a bit of a history. And so when you did your Planet Normal piece, Alison, I thought that was really helpful because it made me think, what is it if I took a Colin Brazier approach to social media? Have we ended up in this situation? And I would value someone like you doing something like that, because I thought about it and there were 3 things for me both Conservative and Labour government have contributed to. One of them was the Children Act and the undermining of parental responsibility. The second one was the moral panic around stranger danger, which forced children into their bedrooms and into the homes. And the third thing is the relentless drive to digital, which Tony Blair, through his modernising government, was a real architect of. He undermined the value of knowledge and education, and the delivery mechanism became more important. So I think we need some historical view, because otherwise something like vulnerability, and that becomes a bit of a fracture amongst us where we can get picked off because we want to protect vulnerability and our rights get sidelined as a consequence.
Yep.
A couple of things. One, I think the idea that education is going to give us an answer to solve some of these problems, I'm referring to what Andrew put forward earlier, I think is completely wrong, because you've got to understand the education system we have is rotten to the core. All the values that you see, that you reject in the police, well, they're right through the school system, the university sector, all of it, right? So what are you going to get rid of? Who's going to do the critical thinking? Exactly the people you don't want to have children's minds moulded by. So then the internet, I really get a bit dodgy about the idea that we should shut down children's ability to find information. Right, as if teachers will do a better job. And I argue with teachers who say that they're better than YouTube. No, you're not. You're rubbish compared with YouTube. Ask a child how it learns for its examinations. It goes to YouTube to find out how to solve all this stuff. We've just shut that off. We're idiots, right? So we're actually de-educating kids. Our schools are so bad they can't do this job, so we had the luck for quite a while of having the internet to be able to get around that, and now we're going to shut that off. That's insane. And never mind the fact, it's just fun for kids. Why can't you get past that? Using social media is fun. It's not killing them, it's actually making them happier than they were before. I know you don't agree with me, so that's why I'm saying it.
Okay. Sorry, gentlemen, and then there's someone at the back there who said his hands up as well. Yep.
My question's for Andrew. How successful has the use of satire been in the fight against foolish ideas?
So could you say that again? We couldn't hear you.
Yes. My question for Andrew is, how successful has the use of satire been in the fight against foolish ideas?
Great. And there's someone there with their hand up.
And thank you to everyone this morning. I think there's been a lot of reflections about not only how do we change legislation and policy, but actually how do we get the underlying culture shift that we need to transform the United Kingdom. Now, I think one of the greatest successes of postmodernism in shutting down political discourse has been the integration of identity and opinion, and that we're now in a world where to disagree with someone's rational opinion is to be a personal attack on them as an individual. So I was just wondering if we could have some reflections from the panel on how we overcome this strong personal and emotional attachment to one's opinion in order to actually start debating as rational people and stop feeling that a disagreement on political grounds is attack on someone's character. Thank you.
Can you pass it to the lady just in front of you?
Hello. Is all this the reason that the jury system is being eviscerated by Mr. Lammy?
Okay, it's about the jury system. And yes, you there. And then there's two people at the back.
Is it on? Yeah. So one thing, well, I'm from Thoughtful Therapists, so we are, and with Stella from GenSpec, we're certainly going to be fighting the conversion therapy bill. But I wanted to bring up something that Toby Young brought up in Belfast, which was Lord Moynihan is putting a bill through, because it's about making the regulatory organisations neutral, politically neutral, and I just thought, how much good do you think that'll do, and will it get through? Because I think it could really help us.
Can we get a mic to those two people there in the back, and then one more over to someone really far on the left there.
Hi, yeah, Kerry Dingle from WorldRight. Obviously, Mick talked about how much things have changed and how over the last 20-odd years, Spike has always inspired us and been ahead of the curve. I've just got a broader question, really, which, yes, we want this huge culture shift, but how far does class play a role now? Because it does seem that the authoritarian turn and intensity is class-driven, a hatred of the white working class specifically, and I want to know how far we have to take on board both arming the white working class majority politically and challenging an elite upper class authoritarian view, which isn't just your Zach Polanski's, but is, as we know, across the state.
Great. And gentleman there?
Yeah, thank you very much for the addresses this morning. I just thought they're absolutely brilliant. I want to push back on a couple of things, sort of echoing what other people have said. The ban on all social media, virtually ban on smartphones for children. I just don't understand the logic of us standing up here saying the people that say, I don't like that idea, ban it, are wrong, and then immediately saying, ban technology for kids. There's an inconsistency there. Also, the idea that most of us grown adults know that a lot of these ideas we've been talking about are nonsense is of course true. We know that. But anyone that's spent any time in schools or around young people know that these ideas are absolutely taken as given by kids. Why would they not be? They are told them all the time. So if I went home and told the kids I know about the event I'd been at today, they would think I was at a far-right rally, and it would take ages to explain why not. I love Spiked. I've written for Spiked a lot. But if you go and talk to kids, they do not say, yeah, well, of course loads of these ideas are nonsense. Not all of them, but the vast majority would have a real problem with a lot of what we're saying already.
Thanks. Yeah. Can we get 2 mics to the people in the middle there, but we're going to come back to the panel for now. Alison, a lot of that was addressed to you, so I think you should...
Well, we ban alcohol and tobacco for children because they're highly addictive and they're very bad for them. And I'm sorry, I do think that smartphones are of an equivalent risk to children. And with respect to the gentleman over there, the idea that we're rearing an unprecedentedly happy and well-adjusted generation of children is absolutely rubbish. I mean, I have had so many, and you know, people here, I'm sure some people here may listen to a podcast I do with Liam Halligan, Planet Normal. We were one of the few voices Spiked among us who was saying the lockdown was going to be absolutely bloody ruinous for children, which indeed it gives no satisfaction to say it has been dire. And there are young people, I've heard from parents saying they're now, 20-something children, haven't really come out of their bedrooms since then. They are addicted to their smartphones. We've moved from play-based childhoods to phone-based childhoods, and I do think there is a significant price to be paid for that. And I'm afraid, I think in years to come, people will look back and think this epidemic of mental health problems. And I take that gentleman's point, yes, but not everybody is on YouTube doing sort of GCSE history revision. Some of them are watching absolutely, horrendously banal and addictive content. So I accept it's a very fraught, and I'm not going to lambast or be rude about my opponents in this or call them gammons or whatever I was called during the Brexit debate. I do think it's interesting, isn't it? I do think with regard to what the lady was saying there about a class thing, because as a Leave campaigner during Brexit, it very much started to become that the people who were for leaving the European Union, that we were the stupid backward ones, who weren't educated. And it was very much an elite project, wasn't it? And I don't know what possessed me, actually. I insanely agreed to take part in a debate at the Hay Festival on Brexit, which, in looking back, I think you must really have needed your head examining, where I was openly accused of being racist unfortunately for the gentleman who was accusing me of being a Brexit knuckle-dragging racist, it was the week when one of my best friends who was an immigrant had died, and I'd given the address at her funeral, so that wasn't a very good moment for him to accuse me of not liking immigrants. But yes, you're right, there is a lot of class-based stuff, but I think, why can't we say, I voted Leave for good reasons, I did my research like lots of people did, I absolutely respect friends friends who voted Remain for the status quo because they thought it would be tumultuous and difficult. We have to respect that other people have arrived at decisions out of good conscience, do we not?
Yeah. Andrew, there's a question addressed to you specifically about satire. I wondered if you wanted to answer
does
that.
satire make a difference? Probably not. I mean, I would have loved to have thought so. I mean, there was that satirist Hipponax, who, when he satirized people, they got so upset they hanged themselves. And I've never achieved that. I mean, I think the only thing to say about it is that what it does do, I mean, I've always enjoyed mocking and satirizing the worst excesses of the woke movement. But then I started tweeting things, and then they started copying them and actually doing them for real. I just think, just leave my ideas alone. My concern is mostly the plagiarism aspect of that. But yeah, there's nothing so absurd you can think of that they won't eventually come up with. I don't know. I think it helps because I think it allows people to laugh at the absurdity. And especially when you've been told that you're a bigot for even noticing something, and all of a sudden there's someone pointing and laughing. It is the old story of Hans Christian Andersen, The Emperor's New Clothes. You just need the little boy to point and laugh, and then it sometimes can fall apart. So actually, I was being flippant. I think it can be quite powerful. But there were loads of points which I want to come back on. I mean, the point about education, the gentleman was saying about, why am I saying education? Well, isn't education the problem? Education is rotten. But that is sort of my point. My point is that education is rotten. The education system has created these conditions, and so we need to completely change it, completely start from scratch and go back to sort of basic first principles about how kids ought to be educated. And that, of course, leads into this debate that Alison's having with the various people about. Now, I don't know exactly where I stand on that, but what I will say is I do find that the age verification system idea seems to me specifically targeted to acquire data on adults. I think the concern for children is a smokescreen, but having said that, Allison is right that we can't say that it's a free speech issue when you treat children differently. I was a teacher. If a child swore in my class, I wouldn't say, oh, that's free speech then, because to be a free adult, you need to be socialized effectively in youth. I think that's a really important distinction we have to make. So Alison has a very valid point about this. That
actually, Alison is changing her opinion as we're speaking.
Oh, okay.
It's working.
Well, it was a valid point before. But that's right. And but I have all sorts of concerns about this. We know, for instance, from Australia that 80% of the kids who've been banned are still using the internet anyway. So we know it doesn't actually work. And all this is going to do is going to create conditions whereby adults are being monitored. And that's really what it's always been about. So I'm concerned about that. But I do think you need to be careful with kids. One thing the guy down here said about identity, I think this is so important. And he talks about the way in which if you disagree with someone now, they take it as a personal slight. Because we've so sacralized and prioritized the notion of identity that it's even gone beyond sexuality, race, gender, etc. It's now about political worldview. So that's why people, they tie their identity to a political tribe, and therefore if you disagree with them, then you're suddenly evil. And that is a difficult thing to untangle. And again, it comes back to this principle of education, this principle of critical thinking, to understand that if someone disagrees with you, they're not attacking you individually, they're attacking an idea, and you should be grateful to have your ideas tested in that way. That should be considered a positive thing. But we've reached a point where identity has gone so far that people can't do that. And I think that connects to what the woman said about class. And it is a kind of class war, because Alison talks about how she thinks it's just the top layers of these various institutions. And I think, on reflection, I think she's right, because the More in Common initiative have studied the woke movement and the identitarian censorial movement and found that even at its height in America and the UK, it was only ever supported by 8% of the population, roughly between 8 and 10%, which means that it's never been popular among any generation at any point, but those are the people, Alison, who are giving the promotions. And those are so actually, when I talk about a bonfire of the Quangos, and I do think college policing's too far gone, but if you just scrap the ideologues, just find out who the ideologues and get them out so that you can't do that anymore, then actually maybe we could actually do something about it. The other major problem, just to finish, is it is a class issue. Upper middle class people have found a new way to weaponize people and still claim to be the underdogs and claim to be the voices of progress. Whenever these people, look at those posh kids with the sledgehammers, whenever these people are arrested, the Bristol, the Colston Four, who had names like Hugo Ponsford, You know, I'm not making that up. Sage Willoughby. I'm not making it up.
Indigo Rumbelow.
Indigo Rumbelow, for God's sake. So these, you know, these are, this has given them, this has legitimized attacks on the working class and bullying of the working class in the name of progress. It is actually an unbelievable trick that they've pulled off. So I think the class issue is absolutely relevant and we have to address it. But the other final issue I want to say is, someone mentioned making institutions politically neutral. How do you do that? We've already talked about scrapping the people at the top who are enforcing these ideologies. But the other problem you have to face is that the people who are enforcing it don't understand that they're not politically neutral. They think their position is the default because it is tied to their identity, and their identity is good because they live in this Manichaean world of good and evil and heroes and villains. The BBC didn't know that it had a bias problem because it held to account people on the left, on the right, but it was never about party politics. It was about an ideology which meant that the BBC routinely called rapists she. And they can't see it. That's the problem, is that to them, the ideology is invisible. The ideology is just should be the default. And that's what you've got to tackle. And I don't know how you do it, but I would say go right back to education. It has to start there. And it's going to be a long, long, long march through the institutions.
Tom.
So I thought, just picking up slightly from Andrew's points about satire, I think one thing that's really important to remember is that freedom of speech, is it about ensuring that we can have good faith conversations, that we can come together, that there can be a free exchange of ideas? Absolutely. But it's also about the right to be scurrilous, to be outrageous. I mean, really, the right for free speech in this country was built by people like John Wilkes, the 18th century publisher, great hero of ours, a politician, who was sent to the Tower time and time again, not just because he wanted the right to report on MPs in Parliament, but he also wanted to publish obscene poetry about what the Prime Minister was getting up to with the King's mother. So there are these two sides of freedom of speech, which I think is worth bearing in mind. It's the reasoned and it's the principled, but also it's the scurrilous and outrageous, and we lose both of them at our peril, particularly at a time when, because of social media, because of online, we are living through this genuinely, in so many ways, positive technological moment where suddenly anyone can be handed a platform and can sound off about the issues of the day. And I think that combination of our existing speech laws with the rise of social media has produced the insane number of speech arrests that we're seeing today. To come back to the C word, class, I think this is really at the heart of it. Of course, I would say that if anyone's read Spike, they would know that that's a conclusion that we often come to. But there's a couple of different layers to it, one of which is it's fascinating that if you take someone like Jamie Michael, it's a working class man from South Wales, if you look at his video, he's making the kinds of points about illegal migration, about radicalisation, about the threat that allowing unchecked males into the country poses to community safety, that you could read in the Telegraph, that you could see on GB News, that you might see in any array of forums. But because he used the phrase radicalised scumbags, because he doesn't speak in a way which is seen as acceptable amongst the great and good, that is interpreted in such a way as to be so much more inflammatory, that is interpreted in such a way as to justify his arrest and again being held on remand for 17 days. You really see that dimension to the issue. The other thing is that if you really look at and see in practice what this censorious multiculturalist state means, it's sort of bound up with this idea that the whole point of government is the maintenance of order, but also so much is bound up with the idea that the white working classes in particular are a bomb waiting to go off. And this is something which informs so many of the speech-related arrests that we've seen, so much of the outrageous response that we saw from the government in the wake of Southport and the riots that happened there, clamping down not simply on the people who were committing horrific violence and rioting, but people who were taking to social media. Those words, think before you post, being foghorned out by the CPS and the government's social media accounts. We know who the intended audience was for all of that. And I think it goes part and parcel with the fact that if we're talking about our institutions, but also if we're talking about Parliament, people talk about how representation and diversity and so on, and all these groups previously who might not have been in our institutions are now represented at high levels via the very tokenistic and very patronising system of leg-ups which now currently exists. One thing that's absolutely fascinating was if you're talking about various institutions, if you're talking about the police, if you're talking about journalism, if you're talking about the House of Commons, the representation of working class people has actually declined in so many of those different areas. In the case of Parliament, largely because of the fact that the Labour Party has essentially become the political wing of Oxfam rather than the working class. But therefore you start to see why so many of these decisions are made, why so many of these, if you like, unconscious biases exist within the political class, the policymakers. And it just comes back to that point of more democracy, democratising our institutions, starting off with the House of Commons, let's say, would get us some way towards sorting out a lot of these problems.
Can I also just add, really inspired by what Tom said, so these people, they do not hold, they act like they occupy the moral high ground. No, they have absolutely warped values. So we think of Keir Starmer trying to turn down a national rape gang inquiry, probably the most vile and disgusting thing that's ever happened in our history, and he said it was jumping on a right-wing bandwagon. Fuck him, right? Absolutely. Disgusting, you know? And the suffering of those girls, I mean, you can't even begin to describe the depravity. It's an abomination, right? We're not a religious country anymore, but it's a spiritual abomination. And we had Lucy Powell, again, oh, holier than thou, prolier than thou, my God, on any questions, telling Tim Montgomery off for dog whistling by mentioning the rape gangs. These people, they do not occupy the moral high ground, and people like us have to keep reminding them that their views are, that they are on the wicked side of things, right? Actually not defending children from predators. That's the bad point of view.
Absolutely. We've run out of time for audience contributions, but there's plenty of other panels where that overlap with this. So I'm going to get our speakers' final thoughts for now. Andrew, anything you want to say to sum up?
I know we haven't got time, so just very quickly, I think just a couple of concepts that we just need to completely scrap. The concept of hate speech. It shouldn't be something that someone can just say in public on the media and not be challenged and say, well, that's just a ridiculous concept, isn't it? But I mean, for one thing, hatred is a natural human emotion, and you can't wish away thousands and thousands of years of human evolution with the stroke of a pen. You can't legislate it out of existence, and people should have the right to be hateful, to hate things, right? And that's just an element of being a human being. So the other thing that I would love to see us really, really address is this notion of incitement to violence. I think America has got this completely right. They have a test called the Brandenburg test, where if someone is guilty of incitement to violence, it's a very, very high threshold. You know, they have to intend to incite violence, be likely to do so, and any such violence has to be imminent. Now, on all of those grounds, someone like Lucy Connolly was nowhere close. It simply, and all of the studies tell us this again and again. Not only did Lucy Connolly not intend to incite violence, even if she had, she couldn't have with that tweet. It simply couldn't have been done. So we have to get back to the basics on this, the facts of the matter, and what incitement actually means. And we have nothing in law like this to protect people who want to just speak their mind. And part about being human is that it's messy, and people aren't perfect, and they do say the wrong thing sometimes. And this nonsense about trying to reach a utopia where everyone is just lovely and sweet, and we can create, what was that movie, Demolition Man? We want to live like that. Well, I don't want to live like that. I want to live in a world where human beings can be human beings. And I feel like this free speech issue gets to the crux of that.
Tom?
Yeah, sure. No, I completely agree. I think incitement is so at the core of all of this, and I think emulating the kind of standards that they have in America, you know, really where speech was both likely and intended to cause lawless action would be a standard to which we can aspire in this country. Because, you know, all kinds of concepts, all kinds of opinions, speeches, articles, what have you, are intended to generate public passions on one level or another. There was a Supreme Court justice, I forget his name, he said, at the end of the day, every idea is an incitement. So if we get into this situation where anything testy, anything provocative, anything said, even at a moment of national tumult or whatever, should be treated with this level of censorship, we're going down a very dangerous and illiberal road. And I think one of the things that's really curious about the time that we live in is that a lot of the arguments in favour of freedom of speech, if you go back to John Stuart Mill and so on, It's sort of prefaced on the idea that we need freedom of speech because it protects the opinion of the eccentrics, of the dissenters, of the minorities. And of course, that's absolutely true. There are always going to be those who are so outside of the Overton window, and if we do not defend their free speech, then we cannot complain when our own free speech is clamped down upon. But precisely because we haven't defended their free speech, we now live in a curious time, which is often the majority position that is demonized, even censored. If you're concerned about mass migration, if you don't think a woman can have a penis, we can go through the roll call of positions which are utterly commonsensical to most people in the country and yet are treated as heretical and strange by the great and good. We see really the heart of the problem. Ideas like hate speech, the reason that you can't define them is that ultimately it's just opinions that the establishment hates. And until we push back, I think, via more democracy, not less, via more courage in amongst individuals as well as institutions, people who are in a position to speak out, that's when we're really going to start making some progress by having precisely that kind of culture of freedom of speech that I was talking about at the beginning.
Fantastic. And Alison, finally.
Well, I agree with my fellow panellists. I just want to say I was on the campaign trail in South Wales and the local election was Nigel Farage, and he was being absolutely bombarded by sort of censorious young BBC journalists about what about the climate emergency, what about this? And he said, I don't care. He said, I care about people's jobs. He said, I care about people being frightened of their bills. I care about children being scared and parents being scared of children's safety. Tom's right. These people, they don't hold the moral high ground. We are the majority, they are the few, right? And the reason they are ramping up the censorship is because they, at some level, they know that these views are the warped views, right? They are the warped views, not our views. Our views about not wanting millions and millions of people, undocumented males, coming into our country and being distributed around our country. Objecting to that, that is the sane moral position. They are wrong, we are right, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Can I have a huge round of applause for all our panel.